Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your EyeOpener report for BoilingFrogsPost.com. In an age where women are being arrested for holding signs warning drivers about speed traps up ahead, police across the country are swooping in to shut down children's lemonade stands, and new traveling Viper teams are bringing that special brand of TSA tyranny to the streets of America, it is perhaps a morbid speculation to ponder which particular aspect of modern American life would cause the Founding Fathers to spin in their graves the most vigorously. But it is not idle speculation after all, and if the respect for individual liberty that the country was supposedly founded upon means anything at all, surely the axe of tyranny must necessarily be striking closer or further from the root of the tree of liberty with each swipe of its blade. Freedom is a word that has been so abused in the modern era that it is difficult to remember that it is not just a campaign slogan or a nebulous item that causes Al-Qaeda boogeymen to hate us. It is an ideal for which our ancestors fought and died, an ideal that for the vast majority of human existence was almost literally unthinkable. In the earliest civilizations, the pharaohs and emperors were worshipped as gods on earth. In these societies, life was nasty, brutish, and short, and most of it was spent performing back-breaking labor in the service of another. For many, as in Imperial China for instance, the greatest position that the average person could obtain was that of court eunuch, permitting them access to the Forbidden City and all the unimaginable riches of the imperial court. Riches they could see, but never partake in. To the inhabitants of this era, speaking of freedom and the natural rights of men and women would have been to speak in a foreign and untranslatable tongue. In the Middle Ages, things were hardly any better. Society was pictured as a beehive with a rigidly defined and divinely appointed order. At the very top was the king, appointed by God himself to rule over the kingdom. Below that, the nobility, clerics, and scholars. Below them, the knights and warrior class. And at the bottom, the vast majority lived as peasants, scraping out a subsistence living from the sweat of their labor. In this era, too, to talk of the freedom of the individual would be to propose a concept that could scarcely be comprehended. It wasn't until the invention of Gutenberg's movable type printing press and the spread of Enlightenment ideas throughout Europe in the 17th century that our modern conception of freedom began to be articulated. John Locke in particular was one of the key inspirations for Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, who formulated the idea of government by consent and postulated the right of life, liberty, and property. In Locke's philosophy, private property is derived from labor, the principle being that, as we own our bodies, so too do we own the products of the labor that we perform with that body. But now that most basic form of freedom, the freedom to do what we like with our own bodies, and the attendant freedom from outside coercion by others, is under assault at every level.
Following the lead of New York City, Albany County has banned trans fats in restaurants and bake shops. Restaurants seem to be dealing with the changes, but Rachel and several other bakers have resisted, arguing the ban is changing the taste and texture of products, especially cakes. She also says it's unfair that supermarkets and national stores with bakery departments don't have to follow the same law. Longtime Cohoes legislator Gil Ethier agrees.
We shouldn't be involved in stuff like this. It's not our role, I believe, as a legislature in the county of Albany.
All right, California is about to pass a law that allows a 12-year-old girl to get the HPV vaccine without parental approval. So what happened to parents' rights?
The feds busted Oaksterdam University, where they teach the growing and marketing of weed. Why did the feds do that?
They've been doing that systematically since Barack Obama became president. He has raided more legal medical marijuana facilities already in his tenure than George W. Bush did in 8 years.
Lithium is a medication that in prescription doses treats mood disorders in people with bipolar disorder or manic depressive illness. And what these researchers found in Japan is that lithium is present in trace amounts in the normal water supply in some communities. And in those communities, they have a lower suicide rate. And so they're really investigating whether trace amounts of lithium can just change the mood in a community enough to really, in a positive way, without having the bad effects of lithium, to really affect the mood and decrease the suicide rate. Very interesting concept. You know, it's the same reason why we put iodine and salt, fluoride in water. There's many different examples of when we put trace amounts of chemicals in the normal supply of food or water to help people's health.
Like so many other tyrannies, this particular form of oppression, too, has been sold to the public in the name of safety. In this case, supposed concerns over the safety of foods and medical treatments have given rise to large, powerful bureaucratic agencies like the FDA that act as regulators. These bodies have been given broad legislative and judicial powers in the name of creating a regulatory framework for the country as a whole, powers that by their very nature are inherently tyrannical.
What are the biggest threats as we sit here today, you think, to our health freedom right now?
The greatest threat to our freedom is really a microcosm, health freedom is really a microcosm of the bigger picture of the threat to our freedom in general. We began this nation with the notion, expressed well in our Declaration of Independence, that just governments derive their basis for legitimacy on the consent of the governed, and that just governments are dedicated to the protection of our rights, our civil and economic rights. Indeed, that's the very purpose of government in the minds of the Founding Fathers, is to protect civil and individual rights. And we started off with a limited federal republic, and with doctrines and provisions in the Constitution that were well accepted to limit federal power. And federal power was viewed with grave suspicion because those in government were thought to be invariably subject to corruption, to use power for their own personal interest. And these magnificent provisions in the Constitution that limit power and prevent such things as delegation of governing power to the FDA, enabling the FDA to have legislative, executive, and judicial power, and to wield that power independent of Congress through an unelected FDA commissioner over the entire American public, dominating over a quarter of all goods and services in this country, which are health-related products. That type of thing was called tyranny in the founding of the Republic. James Madison said that if you co-locate any two of the following three powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, you will have the very definition of tyranny. It was against an absolute monarch possessed of those powers, who was unrepresentative of the American people, that caused an American Revolution. And so we have transformed the United States from a limited federal republic into an unlimited bureaucratic oligarchy in which the very foundation of the country no longer exists. These entities do not operate based on the consent of the government. They are not our legislators, they're not our representatives, and yet they make 9/10 of all the law that govern us.
Bodies like the FDA are worrying because they have been granted broad powers to regulate what people can or cannot do with their bodies. The so-called self-proclaimed authorities are increasingly claiming the power to regulate and restrict the sale of alternative medicines, homegrown organic foods, and even raw milk. Even worse, they are increasingly attempting to cross the line into medical martial law by prepping the public to accept invasive medical procedures with a growing insistence on mandatory vaccinations. Most worrying of all, however, is how the federal government is actively working behind the scenes to cede away these powers to even less accountable international institutions in which the ordinary citizen has no say whatsoever.
My name is Dr. Robert Verkerk. I'm the Executive and Scientific Director of the Alliance for Natural Health. We run an international campaign that's based in the UK that works to protect and promote natural health worldwide. The key tool that we use for this is good science and good law, because it's amazing just how bad the science and bad the law is in many of the regulations that are now really negatively impacting our ability to manage our own health. Codex is an extremely serious and important process that attempts to control food globally. As you'll know, food is rather important to us. In fact, it was in the 1940s that the Third Reich understood that one of their key control mechanisms might be to affect a global system of control over food. And many researchers have actually tracked the evolution of those ideas into the establishment of Codex Alimentarius Commission in 1962-63. It has now become a system that outwardly purports to both protect consumers and ensure fair trade practices. In practice, the protection of consumers does not appear to be particularly high on the agenda, hence the allowance of significant quantities of pesticide residues, the significant numbers of food additives, and in the case of vitamins and minerals, what appears like very, very low quantities of vitamins and minerals that are well below those levels that could actually exert a therapeutic health benefit.
The principle of health freedom is really the underlying principle of freedom generally. That I own my body, and that no presumed governmental authority wearing whatever hat or badge can force me into ceding that ownership to them. Whether that be the freedom to drink raw milk or the freedom from being shot up with Big Pharma's latest untested vaccine, is freedom that touches each and every person on the planet's life in the most personal way possible. And for that reason, the fight for health freedom is the key battleground in the war for individual liberty. Echoing the words of George W. Bush, the enemy do hate us for our freedoms, but the enemy is not who we are told they are. This video is brought to you by the subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information on this and other topics, please go to BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information and commentary from James Corbett, please go to CorbettReport.com.